Alright guys, today we are going to be reacting to the logistic of German reunification. Thank you so much for the support, guys. We're just going to simply jump into this great video. Let's jump in.
East, the city's public transport company was split into two legal entities, BVG West and BVG Ost. Some of the lines, like U2, were simply split in two and no longer traveled across the new border. But others were trickier. U6 and U8, for example, traveled primarily through West Berlin, but briefly passed below the eastern sector in the city center.
That is crazy. Look at that. That's so insane, man. Only that small section will just go through it. That's crazy.
So, to allow for continuous operation of the entire line, an agreement was met between the two governments in which the few stations on the lines in East Berlin were sealed off and removed from service, and trains just simply wouldn't stop at them. Rather, they ran through the entirety of East Berlin at full speed, watched in the closed stations by East German guards to assure adherence to the rules and to catch anyone trying to get on or off, and in exchange, the West German side paid its counterpart usage fees each year. But this awkward situation, West Germans traveling from one part of West Berlin to another via East Germany, a foreign country, fortuitously maintained physical connectivity between the two sides, the very thing so desperately needed when the restrictions suddenly ended. The tracks were in good condition, the station still stood, so a mere 2 days after the fall of the wall, authorities reopened Janowitzbruck station with temporary immigration facilities, providing the first subway link between the two sides in decades. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, additional stations on the U6 and U8 lines opened in succession, each representing another step in making the two Berlins one again. But other lines had strayed far further from their original forms. The U2 line, for example, was split in half here, meaning these were the last few stations on the western side of the wall. Yet, this area was already served by other subway lines, meaning passenger flows on the U2 line in this area were quite low compared to when it continued eastward for many miles more. BVG West therefore decided to shut this section down and terminate service at Wittenbergplatz station instead. In its place, the company transformed Nollendorfplatz station into a flea market and Bülowstrasse into a Turkish bazaar, then ran old heritage trams between the two as a shuttle service to boost business. But ultimately, the truncation left this dense neighborhood bordering the wall underserved by transit, as unlike most of the area previously served by the U2 line, there were no additional subway lines operating in this area. But rather than restarting U2 service,
look at that train will just basically pass over and he cannot stop. Wow. Imagine that, folks, huh?
BVG West opted to use this area as a test case for the hot new transit technology of the time, maglev. As one of the first operational maglev systems in the world, the Berlin M-Bahn spent years upon years in testing and trials, and it technically didn't even open for full passenger service until 1991, 2 years after the fall of the wall. But that service was extremely short-lived as its tracks stood atop those of the former U2 line, and it would lose its purpose as soon as full U2 service was reinstated. So, a mere 2 months later, dismantling work began, and after 2 years of reconstruction work, the two halves of the line were reconnected and full U2 service began once again. But Berlin was also a tiny portion of the two countries in the process of reunifying. Therefore, essentially every issue that existed with the truncated Berlin subway and more were present on the national level, particularly in the East. That's because the Soviet Union, the power initially directly, then later indirectly overseeing East Germany, had dismantled huge amounts of rail infrastructure, then shipped it to the motherland as a form of war.
Look at that, bro. Man, those Russians, the Russians were rough, man. I'm not gonna lie. They were very rough individuals. Man. Ugh. I don't know what to say about the Russians, man, but sometimes it's kind of weird how they do business. That's so weird.
Or reparations. They took essentially every bit of rail electrification infrastructure, meaning while West Germany was building maglevs and testing its first high-speed lines, East Germany was still running steam trains. In addition, essentially any section of railroad that had more than one set of tracks was stripped of its extras, meaning the entire country's railroads were operating using highly inefficient, capacity-constrained, delay-prone single-tracking methods. And even with the tracks that remained, the catastrophically poor East German economy devoted little to track maintenance, meaning the lines slid further and further into disrepair. Travel between Berlin and Hamburg, now Germany's two largest cities, took over 4 hours despite a transit time of less than 2.5 all the way back in 1933. And this was common. With the exception of those used to get West Berliners to the rest of West Germany, any rail line that crossed the inter-German border was in the poorest of poor condition, since for so long there had been so little demand for travel between the two countries. In short, for 4 decades, West Germans had overwhelmingly traveled west, East Germans traveled east, and now that predominant flow was suddenly reversing 180 degrees. To rectify this, enormous amounts of public spending were greenlit, summing to $20 billion for the reconstruction of east-west rail lines, then an additional $16 billion for highways, which faced a similar set of issues. And these reunification infrastructure projects were so colossal that they're not even done yet. For example, the
really?
VDE number 9
Nah, I cannot believe that. They're still not done yet? Nah, I cannot believe that.
project, encompassing upgrades to the east-west rail line between Leipzig and Dresden, was started in 1993 and is not expected to be complete until 2030, with level crossings and other older technologies necessitating slower speeds remaining around Riesa. But merging West and East Germany into one was not as easy as rectifying the physical scars of the borders because, after all, they were two entirely different countries. That meant there was a rather simple question of whose rules to follow and which institutions were in charge. Just 4 months after the fall of the Berlin Wall came another momentous occasion, but one far more structural than symbolic. While 30,000 East Germans had decided to vote with their feet as the Soviet Union's borders softened, a staggering 11,604,000 of 12,426,000 registered East German voters came out to vote in the region's first free and fair election since the 1930s. While no single party won a majority in the legislative election, voter sentiment was clear. Winning 192 seats in the 400-seat Volkskammer, the Alliance for Germany, comprising the Christian Democratic Union, the German Social Union, and the Democratic Beginning parties, ran on a platform centered on immediate German reunification, rights to private property, and a tagline of "Never Again Socialism." Eastern voters wanted Western policy, and quickly, Eastern politicians made it happen. In the wake of the election, the Alliance for Germany entered a grand coalition with the election runner-up and owner of 88 parliamentary seats, the Social Democratic Party. With a 2/3 supermajority that gave the coalition the ability to alter the constitution, change came in revolutionary proportions. In May, the parliament ratified a law to harmonize the monetary, economic, and social union between East and West. Soon, the East would use the Deutschmark. In June, the body amended the constitution to protect private property rights and began the process of dismantling the Stasi, the notorious state security force. Within just months, East was beginning to mirror West. Then, with a 299-80 House vote accepting terms of reunification, the nation signed the treaty on the final settlement with respect to Germany, along with West Germany, the US, the UK, the Soviet Union, and France. East became West, effectively folding the East into the West. On the strike of midnight, October 3rd, 1990, a German flag rose in front of the Reichstag.
That has to be one of the most crazy experiences ever, man. You're reunifying your country, man, after all that weird stuff, man. What else you can say? What else you can say, man? That's...
With a horizontal tricolor and without the East German national emblem, as the Federal Republic of Germany was officially a single sovereign entity and the German Democratic Republic ceased to exist. But now, the hard part. Turning east to west required restructuring from the ground up. Take, for instance, the very demarcation of administrative boundaries. Prior to reunification, West Germany was broken into 10 federated states where, in a system not so different from the US's, governing was mostly local and power flowed from voters through locally elected officials who then represented their interests at a state, then federal level. East Germany, meanwhile, while smaller in population and area-free cities. Rather than leaning on stronger, self-governing states, this system relied on top-down management from a powerful central government and weak districts and counties. Administration of East Germany, then, had to be effectively flipped upside down if it were to mirror the West. The first phase of reframing Eastern administration was straightforward enough. They just got rid of the Bezirk borders, returned the former states, and upsized counties so they were less numerous and more manageable. This much was doable within just a year. Where the real challenge arose, however, was in figuring out how to turn these new administrative units into fairly independent, self-governing institutions, something that both structure
So basically becoming a state, different states.
And culturally countered for decades of East German history. To provide even the simplest functions of government, the newly unified German state had to move fast to set up courts and prime minister and ministerial offices. Strapped for time and cash, German administrators retrofit as best they could. The state legislator of Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania took up residence in a castle which had previously served as a teacher's college and museum. In Thuringia, the legislation began meeting in a
My bad, folks. So all of a sudden my light turned off. Let's continue.
Large barriers to entry. For one, like the Soviet Union, the GDR was a cadre administration, an administration staffed with those appointed by the party directly, leading to party loyalty and messaging.
Yeah, that's the problem right there, man. Yeah, these people, they're just elected by a bunch of bureaucrats that have no connection with the people, man. And that's when things start going downhill. That's when things start and really started going downhill.
Being rewarded over ability, in turn creating an ecosystem of what one political scientist called politicized incompetence. Effectively, many lacked skill, and more had too close of ties to the Stasi, which had for decades prior leveraged a network of informants to root out Socialist Party dissent. As part of reunification, it had been agreed upon that those who had collaborated with Stasi officials or violated basic human rights could be dismissed from public jobs, which ultimately led to some 1.3 million employees being scrutinized for their ties. Finally, while West Germany imported experts and instructors to work in East German offices and with East German administrators.
Damn, that looks like a super abandoned. It looks like a Baltimore here in the United States. Damn, that looks bad.
There were simply too many state employees to justify, a remnant of a bloated socialist bureaucracy. In June of 1991, East Germany had 634,000 state employees, a ratio of 39 state employees per 1,000 residents, a number that far outpaced the 29.5 in the West. Through focused but painful cuts to such positions, that number dropped to 30 by 1999. At every turn conceivable, the East German government had to be remodeled at best and rebuilt at worst. Courts needed to be modernized, while judges and lawyers needed thorough retraining or direct replacement to follow laws rather than dominant party stances. And then there was the matter of the entire economy. The most fundamental difference between East and West Germany was their economic systems, socialism or capitalism. Therefore, successful economic reunification was a far greater challenge than simply stitching the infrastructure or bureaucracy back together, especially considering the two economies' vastly different fortunes. In the post-war era, West Germany experienced an economic bounce back of miraculous proportions. In fact,
actually, you know what's crazy? West Germany was one of the, they call it the miracle economy, because they bounced so fast, right, that they were better than, you know what's crazy? West Germany was better than Britain, which Britain won the war. Is that crazy? Germany was much better than Britain.
In fact, this era is now referred to as the German economic miracle. The standard of living just didn't stop rising and more or less matched that of France, the UK, and other Western post-war economies. Crazy. East Germany, however, mirrored the economic fates of the rest of the Eastern Bloc. That's to say, shortages abounded, productivity stayed low, and growth stagnated. Therefore, with each year of division, the two sides grew further and further apart, and by the fall of the Berlin Wall, GDP per capita in East Germany was just a third of what it was in the West. So, upon reunification, it was only natural that huge numbers of East Germans immediately uprooted their lives to move west to the area decades ahead in standard of living and multiples higher in average income. It was also only natural that when mixed into one larger free market economy, East German companies previously run by the state, unprepared for competition, were simply beaten. Their products were not as good, their costs were high, consumers simply just didn't want to buy from them. Therefore, in spite of mass emigration, unemployment in former East Germany shot up to over 20%, and industrial production crashed to nearly half of its previous rate. Meanwhile, former West Germany was experiencing the gains from the East's pain as a surge in low-cost labor and quick expansion in demand strengthened an already strong economy, and GDP grew at an annualized rate of over 5%. To stop an all-out gutting of the East German economy, the newly unified government approved a colossal spending program that essentially acted as a wealth transfer from West to East. The goal was to pour money in to create opportunities for employment and industry, which it did, but not necessarily efficiently. For example, $7 billion was awarded to Dow Chemicals to rebuild this plant near Leipzig, but a few years after opening, the facility only employed 2,200 people.
It never works, man. When the government dump money somewhere, it doesn't work. Doesn't work. It didn't work in the United States during the Great Depression. Didn't work. These people were opening everywhere. They were dumping money everywhere. And the art, especially in the arts, there's a famous project called The Work. It didn't work, man. The work didn't work. And basically, it was a program putting a lot of money in the arts, and it didn't work. Because what happened is you put money, as the government put money, inflation rises. So that money that you just got, it goes nowhere because inflation will just take over. It never works. You had to always create incentivized production from the private sector because they're the one building wealth.
Making for an effective per-job cost of $3.2 million. And then one of the largest blunders was the new tax policy that allowed for about half of any investment in East German real estate to be written off. Combined with lofty expectations, this led private West German money to pour into Eastern real estate, but the demand just wasn't there. Leipzig and other major cities were now filled with shiny new hotels, office buildings, and malls that simply lacked customers and tenants. But then there's the aspect of reunification that's less tangible than infrastructure, governance, and even economics: culture. Just as in governance and economics, reunification was a massive task for East German identity. Take it from one particularly influential East German, Angela Merkel, who has spoken on the difficulties of the transition. Living with so much freedom, as she's expressed, was something that had to be learned, as there was a certain comfort in having so much of life already figured out in a centrally planned state. Simple everyday aspects of life changed overnight. Healthcare, education, childcare all began to operate differently when they moved from strictly state-controlled to at least partially free market.
And this is the question that you had to ask. Does everyone want freedom? Think about this, folks. Is everyone in a mindset position, to have freedom? Do they really want freedom? This is a good example. Maybe each German didn't want it. But I think, again, you have to put in this into the other perspective. What if the majority did want it? What do you do there, huh? You have to be willing to go, against that 10%. And that 10% is willing to, to be a little confrontational, right? That's just what happened.
The free market hasn't exactly borne the fruit that was hoped. GDP per capita in what was East Germany is still just 75%.
We're not liking that. I mean, I don't know what to say about it, but this is crazy. As an American, we have a very similar problem. There's a lot of immigrants coming in, right? In some of these states, some of these cities, they're homogeneous, right? Mostly homogeneous. They're just dumping 20 to 30,000 people in just one town that is only 40,000 people, right? So I can understand their sentiment.
Have improved little, and academics suggest that many have conflated these two situations into one, leading a disproportionate number of people to believe that the surge in immigration is the cause of their poor economic status. Therefore, anti-immigrant views and xenophobia...
I don't think so. I think it has to do something with time. We have to just let time take over, because you cannot tell me that... You're telling me that East Germany now is worse than 30 years ago? I mean, I don't live there, but based on the video that I have seen so far, and they have become, a very well-rounded area of the country. Let me know. I might be wrong, but let me know in the comment section below.
Abound in the East. The voting patterns for Alternative for Germany, the country's far-right political party often described as extremist, are so stark that one can clearly see where the inner German border once stood. And this is indicative of the broader phenomena. Perhaps the longest scar of division will be culture and politics. That's because infrastructure and government slowly affect the economy, and then the economy slowly affects politics, so each step moves slower than the last. With economic inequality remaining, one can only expect that this political and cultural divide will too remain for years to come. Nations are powerful forces. They are far more than mere lines on a map. They are determinants of culture, politics, economics, and more, and this history of division demonstrates just how much that simple line can represent. The more and more our world digitizes, the more relevant the internet becomes to our daily life.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. I think in some state here in the Union, in the United States, I think we're like West. I'm thinking about West Virginia, right? The poorest, one of the poorest states in the Union. Poor, it's very poor. I think remote jobs should be a main focus, right? So there's a lot of these towns that, man, if you are smart, you can live like a king, right? But you have to move with times. Some areas in the East Germany are poor. Don't worry. How can I just make sure that, you know, I can have a good life, but at the same time bring some of that income in? Remote jobs, folks. If you know English, you know, if you live in East Germany, it's cheaper. It's, you know, with $25,000, $30,000 a year, you might be, you know, with the simple fact that you can get like a $40,000 a year kind of job living in Germany, you're making it happen. You're making it happen, folks. You're making it happen. You know, it's interesting. It's very interesting. But you know, I would like to know for some guys, some of you guys that live in Berlin, how is the lifestyle? Is it that bad? Is it that bad? Let me know in the comment section below, and I would love to see your guys' opinion. I'll see you in the next one.